A global summit, a sealed mountain, and a president ignored. Before Air Force One even touched down on Canadian soil, the G7 was already crumbling. From the very first moment it was clear, this wouldn't be a gathering of allies, it would be a confrontation. Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, didn't wait for the sessions to begin. He scrapped the joint communiqué, an act in diplomacy equivalent to burning the bridge before crossing it. He refused the traditional handshake photo with Donald Trump. And instead, he sent a message to the world. This is not diplomacy, this is a warning wrapped in protocol, but with the sharp edge of economic warfare. Trump didn't hold back. He landed with demands that felt ripped from a political thriller. All G7 countries must raise military spending to 5% of GDP, new tariffs on strategic goods, and most shockingly, that Canada should be annexed as part of the United States. Yes, he said it seriously, and it wasn't the first time. At a rally in Ohio, Trump had declared that Canada should have been part of the U.S. from the beginning. Ottawa erupted in outrage. Former Canadian defense chiefs called the remarks a direct threat to national sovereignty. The atmosphere in Alberta was tense. Roads were shut down, protesters pushed over 80 kilometers away, and the RCMP enforced a full lockdown. This wasn't about safety, it was about narrative control. What was supposed to be a summit of global economies now looked more like the stage of a geopolitical breakup. Macron played it smart. Instead of flying directly to Alberta, he made an unannounced stop in Greenland. Flanked by the Danish Prime Minister, he posed for cameras and declared, "Greenland is not for sale." It was, honestly, a diplomatic slap to Trump, who had once again floated the idea of buying the Arctic island in a recent Fox News interview. Japan came prepared. Their delegation filed an official complaint with the World Trade Organization over the U.S. reclassification of Japanese aluminum. And Mexico? Mexico came armed with lawyers, trade agreements, and legal memoranda. Claudia Sheinbaum's team didn't come to negotiate, they came to defend themselves. The U.S. wasn't the host, but it dominated everything like a storm cloud over the summit. International media spelled it out clearly. Washington was no longer the referee of global order, it was the agent of chaos. Carney's decision to cancel the communiqué wasn't an outburst. It was a strategic move. It denied Trump a symbolic media win. No document, no signature, no image of unity. Trump left empty-handed. That document would have been his flag to wave back home. Look, the world's leaders back me. But Carney tore it from his grasp before he could raise it. And it wasn't the first time. Back in 2018, Canada had also refused to sign a communiqué under Trump's pressure. But this time was different. This time Canada didn't just protest, it rewrote the rules. Trump's tariffs weren't just numbers, they've already cost Canadian industry over $4.2 billion in 2025 alone, mainly in dairy, aluminum, and softwood lumber. Labor unions are furious, exporters are in crisis. But Carney didn't flinch. In a tense press conference, he dropped a line that went viral. Canada will not turn its budget into a metric of military obedience. Boom. Silence. Washington heard it and burned with frustration. Other leaders weren't smiling either. Germany is facing a €17 billion drop in exports to the U.S. Japan, with a $74 billion trade surplus, is under new threat of steel investigations. And the UK, fresh out of elections, secured only a temporary digital trade agreement, which excludes financial services. Meanwhile, Claudia Sheinbaum faces a looming threat. U.S. tariffs on Mexico's border trade could double unless Mexico adopts a U.S.-style asylum system. And to top it off, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is under active RCMP investigation for alleged state-directed political violence involving Sikh activists in Toronto. Is this still a summit? No, it's diplomatic triage. Each country came not to build bridges but to build barriers. According to Bloomberg, the World Bank now attributes a 0.7% drop in global GDP to U.S.-driven trade volatility. And global capital inflows fell 12.4% in just 3 months. Top cause fear of U.S. retaliation. Yet in Kanaskas, Trump avoided the economy. He focused instead on NATO, demanding more spending, warning that the U.S. won't fund the defense of weak allies. But Carney didn't take the bait. He held firm. No communiqué, no concessions, no theater. The 2025 G7 summit marked the end of smiling photo ops. There's no longer consensus, only survival. And while the world watched the stage, it was Carney who cut the lights. No final press conference, no applause, no joint statement, just a silent summit, and a world watching in disbelief. The G7 was founded in 1975 to coordinate the global economy. Today, it feels like a hollow shell, held together by habit and fear, but this wasn't the grand finale. It was the warning shot. Because if Trump brings the same demands to the upcoming NATO summit, when budgets turn into battle lines, alliances could shatter, not through words, but through decisions no one is willing to sign. For the first time since 1975, a G7 host did the unthinkable. He killed the closing communiqué. The symbolic heart of every summit, the document that binds 7 of the world's most powerful democracies into one message, was thrown out before negotiations even began. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't oversight, it was a power play. Reuters called it a diplomatic ambush. Bloomberg confirmed it was premeditated. Carney had briefed his team days in advance. This summit would not end with signatures. There would be no staged show of unity, not under Trump's conditions. The spark behind it all? A single policy. Quiet on paper, explosive in reality. A 10% universal tariff, blanket coverage. Over $1.1 trillion in imported goods from America's own allies, Canada, Germany, Japan, France, even the UK. It was a declaration of economic supremacy, dressed in legal jargon. Trump announced it with a smirk, framing it as a sovereignty clause. But Carney saw it for what it really was. Weaponized trade. A blunt instrument aimed not at enemies but at partners. Canada could have responded with fire, with threats, with tariffs of its own. But instead, Carney chose silence. Not weakness, strategy. While world leaders gathered in the Rockies expecting protocol and platitudes, Carney's staff quietly printed a different kind of closing document, a chair's summary, dry, procedural, stripped of emotion, stripped of alignment, stripped of Trump. No joint vision, no policy goals, no commitment to trade, security, or climate, just a void. It was a diplomatic vacuum, by design, because in diplomacy absence speaks louder than agreement. And that silence, it became deafening. The message was clear. Canada would not be bullied into co-signing its own economic punishment. Not with $4.2 billion already lost in just 3 months to Trump's targeted tariffs on dairy, aluminum, and lumber. Not with its clean tech and critical mineral exports now entangled in economic sovereignty restrictions crafted in Washington. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a recalibration. Carney redefined the host's role, from ceremonial facilitator to resistant architect. He didn't try to fix the G7, he exposed its fracture. No photo ops, no diplomatic theater, just a mountain summit, and a chair who refused to close the meeting. And with that, Trump lost the one thing he couldn't manufacture: validation. To some, it looked like diplomatic silence. To others, it was strategic shock. France and Germany weren't caught off guard, they were watching. And when Carney pulled the plug on the G7 communiqué, they didn't gasp. They nodded. Macron's advisors described it bluntly. This is not chaos, it's calibrated silence. German diplomats echoed the sentiment, not disorganization, tactic. Because when Carney removed the stage, Trump lost more than words. He lost the optics. No signature, no staged handshake, no triumphant press conference, no photo to brandish on Fox News or Truth Social. And that was the point. The irony? Trump had already made this personal. In a fiery March 2025 campaign rally in Ohio, he shouted to a roaring crowd, Canada should have been part of the United States from the very beginning. He called the border artificial, mocked Canada's military size, and claimed its resources were better managed by America. To his base, it was a punchline. To Ottawa, it was a provocation. To Carney, it was a red line. Because this wasn't just about tariffs anymore. This was about sovereignty. And unlike previous Canadian leaders who might have offered a stern press release or called for calm, Carney didn't blink. He went on the offensive without raising his voice. Trump's trade war wasn't theoretical. It was already bleeding Canada dry. Just 3 months into 2025, Canada had lost over $4.2 billion in export value, primarily in 3 critical sectors: dairy, hit with a 22% duty; aluminum, slammed with 10%; softwood lumber, burdened with 14%. Factories in Ontario slowed, mills in British Columbia halted production. Thousands of jobs entered a holding pattern, and yet, there was no retaliation. There was no rage. There was Carney, sitting in a lockdown resort in the Rockies, calmly pulling the thread on Trump's narrative, one stitch at a time. European leaders saw it, and for once, they didn't step back. Macron, emboldened by his symbolic detour to Greenland, pushed the French delegation to frame the entire summit as a defense of democratic sovereignty, a direct rebuke of Trump's expansionist language. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, under domestic pressure from exporters losing billions to U.S. tariffs, adopted the same posture, quiet firmness. No concessions, no facade of harmony. Even Italy, usually hesitant to challenge U.S. leadership, warned privately that the summit's collapse could trigger re-evaluation of Euro-Atlantic coordination mechanisms. And Japan came ready. Foreign Minister Shigeru Ishiba submitted emergency documentation to the WTO over U.S. aluminum reclassification. It wasn't just a protest, it was a legal minefield. And while Japan was careful not to antagonize Washington directly, behind closed doors Tokyo's diplomats warned of retaliatory precision if provoked further. Meanwhile, back in North America, the tone hardened. Carney's refusal to endorse Trump's economic narrative sent ripples through both Wall Street and Parliament Hill. Market analysts debated whether this was the beginning of a North American trade decoupling. And in Ottawa, political parties across the spectrum rallied behind Carney's stance. Even conservative opposition leaders publicly supported the move, saying, "There are moments when national dignity comes before political rivalry." It was no longer a partisan issue. It was existential. The data backed him. According to Statistics Canada, dairy exporters reported a 37% drop in U.S. sales in the first quarter. Aluminum output declined 24% across Quebec. Lumber shipments fell below pre-NAFTA levels for the first time in 15 years. Trump's tariffs weren't just pressure. They were blunt force economic trauma. And Carney, knowing this, refused to be cast as a subordinate in Trump's global theater. He dismantled the script. He dimmed the lights. He invited the world to see through the illusion. No final statement. No "we agree to disagree." No camouflage. Just a cold, clinical summary of events, signed by the host and no one else. But Carney wasn't alone anymore. The European Union had quietly activated its tariff defense protocol, an emergency mechanism that triggers automatic retaliation if U.S. duties cross a certain threshold. And they were close. When Trump hinted at a potential 17% tariff on European machine tools during a private breakfast session, French and German officials didn't protest, they noted it and triggered contingency clauses. As one EU diplomat told Reuters, "We're not going to shout, we're going to recalculate prices." Even smaller players took positions. Spain circulated a document urging EU states to reconsider trade dependencies on the U.S.-Ireland proposed conditional alignment with Canadian clean tech in case Washington imposed further restrictions. In Tokyo, the finance ministry ran emergency simulations showing that if U.S. aluminum tariffs expanded to electronics, Japan's third-quarter GDP could shrink by 1.3%. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was preparation for rupture. And still, Trump tweeted about NATO, about spending, about winning. But inside that G7 summit, he was alone. A president without a pact, surrounded by allies turned chess opponents. And Carney? He just watched, quiet, composed, immovable, not with rage, with resolve, because sometimes silence isn't absence, it's dominance.